So let's dive into simple assets. We will tell you about all of the simple asset actions, about the data structures, about some key decisions that we made as we developed simple assets, and about a few lingering questions that we still have and we would love for you to weigh in on if you have an opinion. So of course, there is a create action. The author is the program, the game, or the other application that creates assets. I will probably be using the word game in this presentation when I mean game or other application. Category is however an author wants to categorize their assets. Owner is the EOS account that holds the asset and has control over transfers. And then here's where it gets interesting. IData, IMData, immutable data, and mutable data. IData is a string of key value pairs, and it's all the stuff that will never change after creation of the asset. MData is a string of key value pairs that specify all the aspects of an asset that can change over time, and we'll talk about require claim in a moment. So of course there's an update function where the author can change the mutable data or add new mutable data, whatever they want. There's a transfer function that belongs to the owner. The owner can transfer from or to. And there is a burn action also, which is also the domain of the owner. Now, these actions, offer, claim, and cancel offer, we introduced them because of a memory issue. So if all you do is use the transfer function, the ownership becomes somebody else's, but the person doing the transfer spends the RAM or pays for the RAM. So for example, if I transfer an asset to you, I pay for the RAM. If a game creates an asset right away with a different owner, it is the game that pays for the RAM and not the owner, unless they put a flag here to require a claim. How does the claim work? Well, it simply posts the asset for somebody to take, and then that somebody has to actually claim it, and they're the ones that use the memory. These two actions are for an author to communicate with a marketplace or an asset explorer, and they are optional. The author does not need to use them, but the author can specify a little bit of information about themselves, and they can suggest how their assets should be displayed as well by registering. And then the asset markets have the option of paying attention to the suggestion or not. And lastly, we have two actions, delegate and undelegate, that have to do with lending and borrowing assets. So we made these key decisions. We did the offer claim stuff as an alternative to transfers to change the way that RAM is allocated. We decided to make transfers pure transfers. The alternative was to sort of hook the transfer functionality through the author, give the author the possibility of making a blacklist or a whitelist. Maybe that would allow the author to give exclusives to certain marketplaces, and giving the author the ability to stop transfers. So we decided to not have any of this and to make simple assets a standard that expresses sort of absolute ownership of the asset, where the game can still update all the mutable data they want, but the ownership is controlled by the owner, by a player. Next, we decided to register authors. Instead of packing author information and template information into the asset, we decided to give this sort of registration information that turned out to be pretty elegant. Similarly, we decided to have this borrowing functionality as a separate table. And speaking of tables, let's talk about them. There are four. There's the asset table. There's a table which keeps tracks of pending offers. So if you don't want to use transfer, you will create an entry in this offers table. There's the table for authors, which we already talked about. And there's this table which keeps track of delegated assets, borrowed assets. Let's look at more detail. All right, we've talked through the asset structure already. We are going to make a recommendation both to asset creators and to marketplaces and other applications that list assets, that they either create or look for 3 fields: name, image, and description. Doesn't matter if they're immutable or if they're mutable fields, but we suggest that asset creators include these 3 fields and that marketplaces look for them, and those will be the basis for displaying a digital asset on simple assets in simple assets. There's a table for offers, pretty self-explanatory who is offering to whom. We decided to add a date in there as well. And there's a table for authors, which we talked about. The data field is just information about the author, and the S template is a string of key value pairs that say, hey, this field should be a URL, this field should be an image, this field should be an audio file, video file, maybe this field should be hidden and you shouldn't display it at all. It is completely optional for the author to use this, and it is completely optional for marketplaces to abide by the recommendations made here. And lastly, we're just using a super simple table to keep track of assets which have been lent. And this turned out to be very elegant. Earlier, we had tried to pack information about borrowed assets into the asset itself. And what we ended up with was not doing that. So if I lend an asset to you, you will simply become the owner here, but there will be an entry here in the delegates table that the asset has been borrowed. So if a game only pays attention to this asset structure, it won't make a difference to the game whether the asset is owned or borrowed. But if you try to execute any of the owner actions like transfer, offer, burn, simple assets checks to make sure that you are the actual owner and that there's no entry here in the delegates table. It turned out this seems like a very elegant solution, and we like the way it works. Key decisions, of course, was the big sort of immutable and mutable data. We could have easily made category part of the immutable data, but we thought it was convenient to have it as its own field. That it means a little more RAM, but a little less work to search for stuff by category. However, we decided not to index by category. We decided it was kind of the intermediate road. We decided to have a separate category field, but not to index by it. Indexing by category means an extra 128 bytes per asset. We didn't think it was that big a deal either way, but we decided not to index. By the way, our asset table by itself is about 200 bytes. So if you want to use assets at all, you'll pay for 200 bytes. And every asset itself is from about 600 bytes. We think that's pretty compact. Moving on, we decided to have a separate authors table rather than packing author information into the asset. Similarly, we decided to have a simple delegate table instead of packing, lending and borrowing information into the asset. And lastly, number 6, this is the most interesting one. We decided against having an owner editable field. Now, what do we mean by owner editable field? Let's look back at the asset structure. So the M data is a field that only the author, only the game, can edit. We thought it might be really interesting to have a field that only the owner can edit. Now, a game can certainly create logic by which the owner, through the game, can update part of the mutable data. But we thought it would be really interesting if just through simple assets, the owner can update a single field. And we wondered if that would create a lot of possibilities and interesting functionality that might be useful. And as interesting as it was, we couldn't really think of a strong use case. And because it took up more memory, we decided against it. But we want to hear what other people think as well. Moving on, possible additional functions includes fungible tokens, either as part of simple assets or as a different contract. Here's an example of an asset. We did create a sample game that we'll show you in the next video or in a couple videos. It's called Kolobok, and it is a kind of rough clone of CryptoKitties. So in the immutable data, you can see the birthday, you can see some information about the parents. And in mutable data, you see, for example, the number of children that this one has. And the name is also mutable data because we decided that in our game logic, we would allow the owner to update the name within 24 hours of birth. So we have an alpha version. We're moving very fast, and we're thinking of launching fairly soon. Here are some critical URLs. Please come to our Telegram channel and tell us what you think. And stay tuned for more. Cheers.